I'm going to let you know what I do when a client reaches out to me and says, hey, I found land. I want to know if I could bring my horses, build a custom home, barn, and arena. Can this work? So I'm working with buyer clients. I get to know that. I always have them fill out an equestrian questionnaire. I work through it together so I can make sure that I know what their thoughts are for now and what they might want it for in the next couple of years. So this particular client's called me and they said, look, Denise, we've been stalking this 10-acre property in Apex. What are your thoughts? So here's kind of what I do when I'm doing my due diligence, sometimes even before we even go to the property. One, of course, I'm going to check out to make sure that horses are allowed on the property, because if not, there's no point moving forward. The second thing is I love looking for every document. I will go back to the very first deed. So when I'm looking at documents and pulling, I'm looking for the following. I'm looking for deed restrictions, restrictive covenants, if there's an HOA, anything that will come along that might be a glitch or anything that stands out to me that opens another door for me to go to anything else. So I'm looking at registered deeds, I'm looking on the mapping, I'm looking at FEMA flood zone, and I'll kind of get over to what are all the other things that I'll look at. But I do a deep dive. And of course, I use the listing documents if they have the vacant land document. For this particular listing in Apex, they had a vacant land document, which was great because it's the seller saying what the land was used for. It also gives me an idea of what they've done potentially on the land prior. This also had an improvement permit. So that's another thing that I'll go to is utilities, because knowing if it's septic or well, or which a lot of the times it is, I want to see where the placement is, if there's any documentation that anything's been pulled, a previous site plan, so I can see what their thought is and what they want their landscape to look like for their property in terms of where the repair field or the septic tank or the well has to be. So I focus on all that. And this property ends up being pretty interesting. So I'll share where we are and I'll carry you through the process and let you know even if we put an offer on it and what all that entails. But right now I am getting as much information. First things first, this property was never built on. It was purchased. It was one family's property, and then they subdivided it into different lots. So this lot is particularly 10 acres. They have an improvement permit. So a soil scientist went out there and a soil analysis determined. And a couple of things that we're learning about this is I'm explaining to them the pros and cons of having an aerobic septic system, which if you don't know, it is a more expensive, elaborate system, not uncommon for a property with larger land with equestrian amenities on it. Sometimes it's due to what the soil can hold, because sometimes the trenches and the soil's shallow or the system's more shallow. So getting all that information, looking at where the soil analysis and soil scientists said, okay, this is one area for a repair field. Here's another area. Here's where the tank can go. What's cool about this property is that I was able to find out that, of course, you could have a well on the property after looking, but the 1 acre actually has county water. So with the septic permit, they submitted a site plan. So they even have where they were going to have the house, which gives us a great idea. It shows where the driveway is going to be. There is a pond on the property. And then with that, I send this information, including this one has a survey, to my clients. And what I love about these clients is they drew all over the plat map of where they wanted to have their riding arena, where their thoughts where pastures would be, as well as even their barn. And then I take that, I overlay it with the survey and the information I have about the utilities, the septic, and their original site plan. And I'm like, hey, here's what I've learned. In doing all this research on the documents, you can find, even with deed restrictions, if there's a blue water line, if there's water restrictions, if there's a protective water site on the plan, or protective water, can't even think the word, water conservation, or there's conservation land around. So all these things, there's protective areas on certain properties, and this one has them. So we were able to determine where they were and kind of move around some of the ideas that they had on the property so it would work. They even were talking about wanting to move the driveway to potentially go off to a state road. And I was explaining to them that we have to go through the NC dot to do a permit to apply for access. So I find out everything I can on the property. And what I do possibly different is I don't find out how to make what they want work. I do it kind of backwards. I try to find out what can go wrong with everything they want on the property. And I'm never going to find everything. I always learn along the way, but it's my job to try to prevent surprises and reduce the risk of you moving on to the property and then realizing you can't build or develop or do what you want on the property. So on this property, where we are so far is that we have the septic. We know that it is an aerobic system, so not an anaerobic system. So I sent them the pros and cons of having the system, which is not uncommon on equestrian properties or land, or some of the lands in North Carolina that are not conducive for a anaerobic system. Aerobics are more pricey. I've researched, I've sent them the pros and cons, the cost of the system, which they're more expensive, and also the 2 repair areas that were identified when the soil scientists went out there and determined that. So we have that with the placement of where they want the home and where the site plan was. They can have the home on community water, which opens up the idea to having either a deep well, a couple of ag wells by where they want their barn. Also looked into if they can have an expansion tank, or where the septic tank was, could it run to the home and then also run to the barn. So it is a 4-bedroom tank, and there's different ways that we could look in the future, whether having a second septic site, because it LTARs in more than one place, or if we could do an expansion tank to the current one. So all these things I research, go over, and look at. We also then go into NC DOT to see what needs to happen if they do want to add a second driveway or a U-turn for their trailers, if they want dual access from one road to the next, what we have to do to apply for that. So we've been working on that. Look at restrictive covenants, deed restrictions. This was owned by a family that subdivided these lots. And so it's interesting just looking to make sure the original deed, that there aren't restrictions saying this piece of property cannot have this. And then looking at the restrictive covenants to see if they expire. As of right now, in my initial research, there's no restrictive covenants or deed restrictions. It does talk about following zoning, and it is in residential zoning. Once I get the information on the land, the actual tax parcel, I'm like, okay, this is a great possibility. I then go to all the adjoining acres or tax parcels around to look for future development. What is around, because we're always looking if they're going to be developing on this and they want to have a custom-built, custom barn arena, we want to make sure it's going to appreciate and that the homes around it will match, or it's in an area that will support what they want to build. So there are government properties around there, and researching that, looking at any noise control, anything with a lot of people that want equestrian properties want to avoid power lines going over the property, and again, noise, anything that's going to be built. So that's where we're at now. And I pulled all the tax parcels around, give this all to them, and now in the process of connecting with the neighbors and just kind of getting a feel. And this is even before we walk the property. So next step, they still are interested, which I think this really could be a cool piece of property. We will meet, we will walk the land, not once, not twice, several times. Hopefully my next video will be at the land, but I wanted to share that the documents that are pulled between the utilities, the septic permit, work with the NCDOT, look at any special use permits to find out what types of septic, if it's on there, and then create kind of a site plan and a dream landscape to see if there is a lot of open space, knowing that we can grow pasture even if there's wooded area, and then placement for an arena. So we had to shift some things around because there is a stream at the top where we were thinking about the riding arena and their pasture land. But knowing this and collaborating and working together and designing the property really gives us an idea when we walk the land. Does it make sense now that we're here? Now that we have this blank canvas, here's our map, let's walk. And that's what I pride myself in doing, is being a detective, a problem solver, one that will try to negate ideas that you have to make sure that we've really tossed around everything that I can think of. And those things that come up, I will work with somebody. If I don't have the answer, I will find that answer. So stay tuned as we explore this 10-acre property in Apex to make it a potential equestrian property for a family to bring their horses home.